Welcome to the Hearing Horizons podcast from the Hearing Review. I'm the chief editor of the Hearing Review, Melanie Hamilton-Basich. I'm joined today by Duncan Floyd, an audiologist with almost 30 years of experience who's practiced in Canada, China, and the United States, to talk about a method of masking that some hearing care professionals might not be familiar with, the optimized method. Duncan currently works in Halifax, Nova Scotia in an ENT clinic, is an adjunct professor at Dalhousie teaching acoustic immittance measures, and is co-owner of Accessible Hearing Solutions. He also has a new book all about masking for audiometry. Thank you for joining us today, Duncan.
Thanks for having me on, Melanie. I really appreciate it.
Your book, The Masking Handbook for Audiometry, covers a wide range of information, methods, tools, and reference materials. But today we'll be focusing on Robert Turner's optimized method for masking. To start, can you summarize what the optimized method is and share an example of a situation when you would use it in practice?
Sure, I'd be happy to give a summary of it. Basically, the optimized method is a method of masking for certain situations. The method was, as far as I know, developed, and it was certainly introduced in 2004 by Robert Turner, who was affiliated with the Louisiana State University Health Science Center. And he wrote two articles in the International Journal of Audiology in that year. And this method of masking is basically for a certain type of hearing situation that we frequently encounter when testing people's hearing, and it's for asymmetrical hearing losses. And what that refers to is when you have a person or a test subject who has pretty good hearing in one ear and a significant or poorer hearing in the other. So in other words, the hearing between the two ears is different. One hears pretty good and the other has more of a robust decrease in the hearing sensitivity. And so the method was developed to test hearing thresholds. It could be pure tone hearing thresholds. It could be air conduction hearing thresholds or bone conduction hearing thresholds, or it could be speech thresholds, either speech detection or speech recognition. And it's meant to provide a masking procedure for asymmetrical hearing losses when you're testing the poorer ear only. So in other words, you have one ear that hears quite well and the other ear that hears, I'm just going to say poorly, just for ease of understanding. So when you're testing any of those items I just listed, air and bone, tones or speech on the poor ear side, we can use the optimized method of masking. And the typical and well understood and great method of masking for many years now, since it was first proposed in the 50s, is called the plateau method. And the plateau method is still our foundational method of masking. But the difference between the optimized method and the plateau method is that in the plateau method, the tester, the clinician's focused on the hearing of the non-test ear in creating a masking level. So in other words, when you're testing hearing and delivering masking or deciding on delivering masking with the plateau method, you look at the hearing of the non-test ear and look at the thresholds and then compensate for the hearing thresholds and then add masking on top of that. And that ensures that the non-test ear will hear the masking in that ear. And with the optimized method, the reference is actually the hearing in the ear that you're testing, or the test ear. So you take the hearing level of the test ear and use that as your reference. And you actually, Turner recommended, and this is what I've been using for years, is you take the hearing threshold of the test ear, you subtract 10 dB or 10 decibels to get a value, and then you deliver that level of masking to the non-test ear. So you're actually masking the non-test ear, but using the test ear as your reference to decide on how loud masking you're going to deliver.
Okay. So, what are the benefits and drawbacks of using this optimized method of masking as opposed to the plateau method or something else?
Well, as long as it's provided, as long as we're kind of using it appropriately, there are really no major drawbacks. We can't use it if the hearing is similar in both ears. So we would avoid that. And we can't use it in asymmetrical hearing losses when we're testing the better hearing side. So it's only can be used when testing the poorer ear in an asymmetrical situation. And one other, I wouldn't say it's a drawback, but it's something to be aware of using this method, is that the levels of masking for people that are used to using the plateau method of masking when testing hearing, the levels of masking with the optimized method can seem startlingly loud or startlingly high intensity. So if you're used to using the plateau method all the time and you stumble on one of these situations and you decide to use the optimized method, a person could be taken aback. It's like, oh my goodness, that's a really high level of masking to be starting with, let alone finishing with. So it can be a little disorienting when we're taught to worry about overmasking and this type of thing. But those are just the two issues I'd touch on. They're not really drawbacks, but two things to be aware of for people.
Okay.
The benefits of using it are quite significant, I would say. The first thing is that it's super easy to learn and it's super easy to apply to practice. So, I mean, it's very straightforward. You take the threshold of the poor hearing ear, the test ear, subtract 10 dB, boom, you've got your masking level and you just jump right in. So it's very easy to learn and adopt.
That's great.
Yeah. The other thing, there are two other things I could mention as well as far as benefits.
Okay, please.
So using this method, it might seem crazy to hear, but you don't have to worry about what's called undermasking. So that's when you're not delivering enough noise to the non-test ear. So you just don't have, it's typically such a high level of masking noise, you just don't have to worry about undermasking. And concurrently, you also don't have to worry about overmasking. So it's got this it's this system where it's built in, you deliver the masking noise, and it's kind of a worry-free, kind of a Zen masking experience. Because
Hakuna Matata.
Yeah, exactly. There's no undermasking worries. There's no overmasking. You're simply delivering masking in an easy way and in a very effective way. And finally, the third benefit would be it just saves so much time.
That's
Yeah.
great. So, to make use of this, what concepts do you think are the most important for understanding this method? For example, what is SIT-IA value that is described in the chapter?
Right. So that's a really good question. And the whole general concept of intraoral attenuation is something that folks should have a good handle on. And if there's one thing about the book that I wrote about masking, it's that there's a bunch of chapters on different masking topics, but the chapter on intraoral attenuation is probably the thing that I'm most proud about the book, because it does a deep dive into the whole issue of attenuation for audiometry. And I don't think anything's been put out that's that detailed, and I also try to make it quite easy to read as well. So the other thing, would have to understand attenuation, and we have to understand the plateau method too. So those are two foundational things. But one of them, your focus on the SIT IA is very important, and this is what Robert Turner had talked about. The whole method is based around this SIT IA idea. And what is the SIT IA? So I've kind of invented two terms to differentiate how we usually use intraoral attenuation information and the situational attenuation that we can identify in some situations. Now, this situational attenuation idea was first identified in 1974. A guy by the name of Frederick Martin from the University of Texas. And he wrote a bunch of important papers for audiometry back in the day. And this one, and one of his best ones was on occlusion effect, which is an important paper for audiometry for sure. It's a classic, actually. The paper that I'm talking about now, it wasn't, the most important thing he ever wrote. It's called Minimum Effective Masking Levels in Threshold Audiometry. And but what he did observe and write about in this paper was the whole idea of a situational intraoral attenuation. And well, what does that mean? Well, let's go back to my example before, where you have an ear that has really great hearing in one ear, which is 0 dB. And then you test the other ear, and all the air conduction thresholds come out at 70 dB. And let's say we're using insert earphones to do those measures. Now, the typical attenuation value that we all learn about for insert earphones is 50 dB. And so that's just kind of one of the standard values that we would use thinking about attenuation when you're engaged in audiometry. What the 50 dB value is referencing, it's meant to project the lowest amount of attenuation that's possible if you look at the whole population of us. What's the lowest amount of attenuation that occur when you put a sound in one side and it will stay on that side, or versus versus crossing over. And for insert earphones, it's 50 dB is a pretty good estimate. I talk about that a lot more detail in my chapter. But 50 dB is a good value. Now, when you're doing a test and you get somebody who has 0 dB hearing in their good ear and 70 dB unmasked thresholds in their poor ear, for that person, 50 dB can't be their intraoral attenuation value. Because if it was, all the unmasked thresholds in their poor ear would have arrived, they would have responded at 50 dB. You see what I mean? 50 dB can't be the value for them because they would have heard all those at 50. So the fact that we were able to put sounds in that were louder than 50 shows that for these people, they have greater intraoral attenuation value than what we typically use in audiometry. And so what I've done is created these terms, min IA and sit IA. So min IA are the values that we've gotten from population-based studies on attenuation. And 50 dB for insert earphones is a good summary of that, pretty good. But by definition, those are kind of extremely minimal values. And most people that come into your clinic are going to have greater intraoral attenuation characteristics. Just as if we were to say, well, what's the tallest person, that we can find as a human being? And we went all through, you know what I mean? And did sample like 10,000 people.
Right.
and maybe somebody is 6'10" or something. That's the tallest we can, that we found in that sample size, but most people are going to be below that. So it's the same with this attenuation issue. It's like we have got minimum IA values that we use for good reason to make decisions about when to mask and so on and so forth. But most people are going to have greater attenuation. And once we identify a situational intraoral attenuation, or a SID-IA, we can use that to our benefit, because then we can start introducing high levels of masking right away, and we're not worried about crossing over and contaminating our testing. We can introduce a loud level of masking noise and know that it's going to stay with the ear that we want it to stay to. So the SID-IA, the whole optimized method hinges around this SID-IA idea. Yeah.
Okay. And so then once you have that down,
Yes.
how can the optimized method help a hearing care professional determine when masking is and is not required?
Well, the optimized method does not help us determine that at all. We would still use the traditional approach to identifying when masking is or is not required. And so for that decision making depends on our min IA values, or the minimum possible intraoral attenuation that we know of. So let's go back to our person who has 0 dB in one ear and 70 dB thresholds in the other. And we're trying to figure out, well, do we have to mask or do we not have to mask? So what we would take our min IA value, let's, for argument's sake, say we're going to use 50 dB, and compare the two ears, 70 and 0, and see if that difference between 70 and 0 is greater than 50, or equal to or greater than 50. And in this case, we would say the difference between 70 and 0 is 70, and it's greater than 50. So it's greater than, the difference between the two ears is greater than what we know to be the minimum possible attenuation. So in that case, we'd have to mask. So the min IA values are the values that we actually use to decide when we should mask or not. And that's because we have to be sure that we're testing the ear that we want to test. And the min IA gives us a glimpse, or shines a light on whether we actually are testing the ear we want to test, or whether it's possible that we might not be. We might be testing the opposite non-test ear. So those decisions hinge on the min IA values, and then when you go to test, you determine your method of masking. And the optimized method is one method that I would recommend that be considered for the right situation, which is asymmetrical hearing losses.
Okay. Why do you think that learning about masking can be so confusing for students and beginners?
Well, I don't know why it would be confusing. Well, there are a lot of moving parts with masking to start with. We've got two different ears. There's two channels on an audiometer. Learners are dealing with, one way to describe our testing when we do audiometry is it's called behavioral testing. So the participation of the subject is very important, and part of the testing process involves, behavior management. So and also there's a lot of jargon involved that can be legitimately confusing.
Right.
So you throw all that together in a stew, and then throw the social dynamic in, where you might have a person who's difficult to test or easy to test, or And so the whole process can be challenging for learners, and masking tends to be uh, one of the big challenges for them. And the jargon is, I think, um, legitimately confusing, and for students trying to get a handle on it. So I think the clearer we speak and write about this issue, the better it is for learners. The other thing I'd mention is the variability that learners can find when they go through the learning process. So you have your academic environment where you learn about the masking concepts and masking theory in a classroom setting, and then you might go to a student clinic and learn a method there. And then you will go out into the field and learn from a couple of different clinicians, probably. And the practice from moving from place to place, there can be differences. There can be difference in how the jargon is used or interpreted. Um, you know, Going way back to when the plateau method um, was first proposed in Sweden and then in the UK and then adopted North America quite quickly through the 60s and 70s. But one of the things that's always been mentioned in writing about the plateau method is that it's time consuming. It's a great method and it works wonderfully. It really does tell us which, for the most part, which ear is hearing the test signals. But the time issue has always been commented on. Going way back to when you learn, into when I was a student in the 90s, anyways. So there's a lot of shortcuts that have been developed by various people of different types. And the other thing,
Okay.
yes, and so the other thing I've done in my book is go through as many textbooks that I can find from basically from the 80s up until more recent years that talk about or have written about masking as in either a chapter. It's usually just a chapter in a larger text, and kind of documented the values that the authors all recommend, whether it's for attenuation or effective masking levels that should be applied, or how much occlusion effect should be accommodated for, and so on. So if you go to the website for the book, you'll see all those data sheets and summaries of recommended values over the years. And they vary from, marginally, but there's all these little variances from author to author.
So that could introduce some confusion as to which ones you use, right?
Exactly, but we all think we're doing it the right way. The right way. So when a student goes, they learn in their student clinic, well, here's the right way, here are the right values. And then they go off-site to maybe a person is my age, a little older, and they may have learned different values to adopt and developed a few shortcuts, but that's the right way. And then they go to a third party, and it's the same thing again. And the interesting thing the learner will observe is that everybody feels that everybody's doing it the right way, but they're all a little different at the same time. So, so I think just there's a little bit of variability can be confusing. And that's really what interested me in the whole process in the first place. Is like, why do we all think we're doing it right, but we're all doing it a little differently too? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But we should accommodate these little differences, I think, as well.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I understand that many hearing care professionals might not be very familiar with the optimized method in particular. Why is that, and why is it beneficial for clinicians to become proficient in using this method?
Well, I think that's true. 100% true. I don't know why it is. I can speculate. But I'll just start about the benefits for clinicians to become proficient in this method. I think it just goes back to the benefits of the method that I mentioned earlier. It's super easy to learn. You don't have to worry about undermasking or overmasking, and just the time saving is it's an awesome amount of time. So, but I think that part of what I said before is that we all think that we're doing masking quite well and the way it should be done. So to make changes to the masking process might be a little bit of a challenge because, um, you know, doing audiometry is a very regimented, repetitive task, and I really enjoy it and I take pride in the craft, but it's very repetitive, and we all have our ways to ensure that it works well. So I think there's resistance to change. Um, it's not a topic that generates a lot of excitement, but I would qualify that and say it does generate a lot of interest when you're trying to learn it because it can be confusing.
You seem to have quite a passion for masking in all its forms. Are there other aspects of masking that, like the optimized method, you feel deserve more attention in education and in the field in general?
Yes, the whole project was a great learning experience for me personally, and and I discovered just so much, uh, so many things that have been generalized that I learned over the years. And so what I was able to do is to really do these little mini deep dives into various topics. For example, there's I think it's might be the last chapter in the book or second last little essay on central masking. So that was a really, I think that's the last chapter that I wrote, and that was really interesting for me because central masking is an issue in audiometry. Some people accommodate for it, and some people don't. But people might be surprised at the um, background information that's been generated for the clinical use of compensating for central masking. It's pretty slim. There's been a lot of like uh, psychoacoustical research on central masking, but as far as uh, using, investigating central masking within the within the field of audiometry, it's pretty slim pickings as to um, the amount of research that's been produced, and so that's very interesting. I discovered that masking for the suprathreshold speech test, like word recognition, is can be
Mhm.
quite complex situation. And I discovered that there have been many times over the years where I've been either undermasking in those situations or overmasking in those situations. So that was a really great learning experience, especially when you're testing one ear and trying to, when you're doing WRS testing and trying to mask an ear that has a conductive hearing loss.
So is that something that you think then that maybe a lot of other audiologists might need to look at more closely?
I think you should definitely read the chapter on speech test masking for sure. It was really eye opening. And I guess the SIT-IA is identified by Turner and Martin. And the other thing is the occlusion effect, which I feel our occlusion effect compensations have probably been underestimated for years.
Okay.
And because what's been done, the recommended values have been using either mean or median values for occlusion. And a lot of our test subjects will be below that, which is good. But a lot of people will be above those values as well. And so William Yakulu, in his book in 1996, produced a series of values that probably um, matches the population-based studies on occlusion a little better. And there's also a paper by Neve de Toro et al. From 2018 in JAAA. It's called Accounting for the Occlusion Effect with Insert Earphones. And that's a really great resource for anybody interested in this topic, as well as the chapter on occlusion in my book as well. So there's so much stuff that I kind of stumbled on that was just of interest to me because I've been doing it for so long. And so just to revisit some of these was really interesting.
Where can listeners find your book, The Masking Handbook for Audiometry, so they can brush up on or learn more about this method,
Well,
as
yeah,
well as many of the other aspects of masking that you cover?
well, that's great. Thank you for asking. So it's available in ebook format and paperback format. And it's basically available um, in all the major vendors, Kindle, Apple.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your insights and expertise on masking. And thank you to our listeners. For more podcast episodes, as well as news and articles, and to subscribe to the Hearing Review and our newsletters, go to hearingreview.com.